and he sought to integrate two very different views of how communities are structured by synthesizing niche and neutral perspectives, rather than dichotomously debating whether neutral or niche models provide better explanations for community structure and biodiversity. He recently submitted a draft of his latest book, Evolutionary Community Ecology: The Dynamics of Natural Selection and Community Structure, which will become one of the stellar monographs in population biology series by the Princeton University Press. Mark has been an amazing contributor to the Society of American Naturalists. He served as editor-in-chief of the American Naturalist from 2008 to 2012, where he maintained and supported its reputation as an author's journal. AmNat is known for its careful reviews that are intended to serve authors, whether or not a paper is accepted. Editors do not simply reflect reviewers and report up and down recommendations. Rather, they add comments of their own and strive to let each author know what needs improvement, whether or not an author is invited to revise or resubmit. Finally, Mark is a laid-back guy who makes challenging things look ever so easy. So tonight, he'll be introducing the award winners for the American Society of Naturalists, and then he'll be giving his presidential address. And when he does, it'll be entitled The Ecological Dynamics of Natural Selection, Traits and the Coevolution of Community Structure. Mark McPeek.
Let's see here. Okay. There we go. So I am up here to talk a little bit about ecology and evolution. And what I want to talk about today, and it's been a theme of a number of talks I've seen already today, is the interface between ecology and evolution and how the feedback processes work between these two, what we typically think about as separate disciplines. And what I want to make the argument for today is that they're really the same thing, but we don't treat them that way, and we need to start doing that. I want to start out this, though, by honoring Robert Payne, who died on Tuesday. Bob was a lifetime member of the American Society of Naturalists, and he was an inspiration to probably 4 or 5 generations of ecologists and evolutionary biologists, and I just want to say this is dedicated to him. Now, we live in an age of genomics, and I've heard a number of people over the years say, if we just, once we get sequences of everything, all will be revealed to us about evolution and natural selection. And I want to make the case today that that's actually not true, and that we really need to pay attention to ecology, particularly with respect to natural selection, because as Dobzhansky said, scientists often have a very naive faith that if you have more data, all will be revealed to you. I think we need to look at the right thing to have all revealed to us. And I want to make the case that we really need to bring back study of ecology when we study natural selection. And that's because genes do not make organisms work well in their environment. It's the phenotype that makes an organism work well. So I doubt we're ever going to find the gene that makes this eagle good at catching fish. Moreover, the success or failure of every species on Earth depends completely on the other species with which it must interact. The springbok, its living or dying depends on how many cheetahs are there and how fast those cheetahs can run relative to how fast it can run. So you have to understand what environment a species faces. What are the other species out there that it's dealing with to be able to understand what its evolutionary dynamics are going to be. And as my friend John Thompson always tells me, it's about coevolution, and I completely agree with John. But coevolution is not just about mutualistic interactions, it's about all species interactions. So if we think about the traits of species, right, when we talk about natural selection, we are talking about the traits of species and how they change, right? There are lots and lots of traits that are ecologically important for all of these different species, and there are different traits that are ecologically important for different species. So the traits that are important in this hummingbird are very different than the traits that are important in this springbok. And we need to start recognizing the mechanistic relationships between traits, ecology, and natural selection. And that's the argument I want to make today. We often have a very easy time thinking about the dynamics of abundance in populations, but species traits also have dynamics, right? And what that implies is that natural selection has dynamics, right? We see the traits of this Darwin's finch population change over time, and it's changing because the form and the intensity of natural selection operating on the traits that the Grants characterized here have changed over these very few generations. That's what I'm going to argue today is what we need to start paying strict attention to and understanding at a very deep level. Now, like I said, we have a very easy time thinking about population dynamics and the change in the abundance of the species. So if you think about this cheetah and springbok, where we've got a resource and a consumer, it's easy to, hopefully everybody in this room can understand the equations I've got up there, right? The change in population size over time is a function of the birth rate minus the death rate of each of these two species. Their population dynamics are linked to one another because the birth rate of the cheetah is intimately tied to the death rate of the springbok. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today, undergirding this mathematically, is Rosenzweig and MacArthur's consumer resource model. So I'm going to be assuming throughout that the resource I'm talking about grows according to logistic growth, so its population is regulated even in the absence of the predator. The predator has a death rate, and they're linked because of this functional response between the two species. But don't worry, because I'm not going to do math in front of you, because I'm not a mathematician, so I'm going to try to do all this with graphs today. But hopefully you'll get it. But when you think about these demographic rates of birth rate and death rate are also functions of the traits of these species. So the birth rate of the resource depends on what traits that resource species has. Right? These equations also describe the fitnesses of the individuals in the populations. Right? You can see this pretty easily by doing some very complicated algebra. So we divide through by the abundance, and we're left with per capita. In a population dynamics context, we think of this as per capita population growth rate, but that's really the fitness of individuals in that population. Right? So the other big picture item that this perspective gives us is that the overall fitness of an individual is composed of components. There's a component due, in this very simple model, for each of the species, there's a fitness component due to birth rate, and there's a fitness component due to death rate. Now, Russ Landy showed us in a paper in 1982 in Ecology that you can take the breeder's equation and use these continuous time population dynamics models to actually model the evolution of the mean trait in a population. So this is effectively just the breeder's equation in a continuous time format. So the change in the mean trait value in the population with respect to time is equal to the additive genetic variation in that trait times the selection gradient that acts on that trait, which is basically just how does individual fitness change as you change the value of that trait, right? So we can do this, we can model this for both of these two species. If we plug those equations in, what this really points out too is that there are selection gradients that operate on these different fitness components. And it really is how selection operates on different fitness components that determines the overall trajectory of natural selection for both of these species. Right? So this is really, excuse me, God. First semester evolution, right? The breeder's equation, change in the mean trait times additive genetic variation times selection gradient. That's all we're going to talk about today. But these equations, I think, give us insight into the dynamics that we should be looking for in the field. But we've got these two sets of equations, so now we can simultaneously describe change in abundance of these species and change in the traits of these species, to look for the joint evolution and the joint population regulation of these two species with respect to one another. Now, that is really important machinery to have, but I think another thing we need to think about is that not all traits are the same. There are traits have very different effects on fitness. And we need to really start paying attention to different classes of traits that are involved in species interactions. So for example, I think one of the things I think Peter Morin, who is using this framework also, was very crucial in identifying was that there are really two critical questions. One of them is, how does fitness change as the trait value changes? Does fitness go up or does it go down? And can the effect of fitness be determined without knowing what the trait value of another species is? Right? And there are really this creates basically an orthogonal 4-panel grid, right? You could think about what Peter calls unidirectional independent traits, something like the amount of time this prairie dog spends in its burrow. So as the prairie dogs would evolve to increase the time spent outside of their burrows, they would garner more food, but they would be exposed to predators more. So in both of these cases, fitness changes unidirectionally. As you change the trait, no matter where you're at for this trait value, if you increase the trait, fitness either goes up or it goes down. Right? Everybody with me good? We can also think of bidirectional independent traits, which is basically just to say there are different areas of trait space where fitness would increase or it would decrease depending when you increase the value of the trait. So that if you're on this side of this peak, your foraging rate would go up as you increase movement rate. So if you think about individuals foraging in the environment, if they move really slowly, they'll deplete resources around them. So if they moved a little more, they would run into patches where they haven't depleted it. But if they move too fast, they may have movement costs, or they just run by the food so fast that they don't pick it up. And so there may be an optimal movement rate that gives them the highest return. But for both of these traits, you don't need to know anything about other species to determine what fitness, how this trait's going to influence fitness. But if you think about another class of traits, things like running speed or swimming speed, which I talk about as invasion speed of predators trying to get away from prey. Right? This springbok, whether it's going to be able to evade this cheetah, depends on the difference in the speeds of these two species. So you cannot say whether the springbok is going to survive this predation attack until you know how fast these two species can run relative to one another. So this is what Peter Abrams called a dependent trait. But in this case, for both species, they will change their fitness in the same direction, no matter where they're at, by changing the trait value in one direction. The springbok will always get away better from a cheetah if it increases its running speed. The cheetah will always catch more springboks if it runs faster. So that's why it makes it a unidirectional trait. And finally, we can think of bidirectional traits. Right? Darwin's finches feeding on seeds. Beak size is a bidirectional dependent trait because the ability of a Darwin's finch to manipulate seeds depends on its bill size, and it depends on the size of the seed relative to the bill. Really small seeds, it has a really difficult time picking up. Extremely big seeds, they just can't get it in the bill. So there's an optimal size of seed that a particular bill size for a Darwin's finch is capable of foraging at the highest rate. Okay, so now that we've got this sort of set out, what I want to do today is to play through what are some important dynamics that come out of this, and what are the important insights for natural selection that we garner from thinking about ecological dynamics and evolutionary dynamics coincident on one another. So what I'm going to do is talk you through a very simple set of models where what I'm assuming is each one of these species has one trait. So the resource has one trait that influences both its birth rate and its death rate, and the consumer has one trait that influences its birth rate and death rate. And I've done a lot of modeling with putting multiple traits in lots of these species, and all of what I'm going to tell you today basically holds up when we go to a multi-trait interaction system. Throughout this, I'm going to assume that the birth rate of the resource is density dependent, and that's what would regulate the population size of the resource. So as resource abundance increases, its per capita birth rate declines, this is basically just plain old vanilla logistic growth for the resource. But the maximum value of the birth rate, I'm going to assume, is a function of this trait. And so as you change the trait value, this relationship between abundance and per capita birth rate slides up and down. So that this point here would be highest if the trait value of the resource is exactly there. And as you change the resource trait value in either direction, this point will decrease, so the whole relationship will go down. I'm going to assume the same thing for the death rate for the consumer. But in this case, the consumer has a minimum death rate, and its death rate increases to contribute to its population regulation. And I'm going to also assume that this minimum death rate in this relationship, when its abundance is very near zero, is what is related to the trait value for it. So that's going to be, these two relationships are going to be true throughout. But what I'm going to do is assume different functional forms of traits for the functional response between these two species. I've considered both unidirectional independent traits for both species, unidirectional dependent traits, and bidirectional dependent traits. And for most of this talk, I'm going to talk about bidirectional dependent traits because basically you get the same answer with all three of them. But if you note, for these relationships, it is impossible to say what the optimal phenotype is for either species. You can't say it because you have to understand how it interacts with the other species, right? So you can't just draw a fitness surface and say that's the right phenotype that would maximize fitness, because you have to know all the things about the other species in this and how these fitness components interact with one another as well. So first of all, I want to consider a really simple community. This community has one consumer and it has one resource. And these arrows are just the death rate of the consumer, the birth rate of the resource, and the interaction between the two. So imagine the following scenario. We've got a plant that's producing seeds, and seed size is the trait for the plant, the resource. It initially is sitting in a local population, and the consumer is absent. So the resource has evolved to its optimal phenotype that maximizes its maximum birth rate. And it's sitting at its equilibrium abundance of that. The consumer then invades the island, and it invades at a phenotype value that minimizes its death rate. There's fitness relationships in this situation is a bidirectional dependent trait. So the interaction between the two depends on the difference in the phenotype values between the two species. And what I'm going to do is just, how does their abundances and their traits change until they get to some equilibrium? So at equilibrium, this is what the fitness relationship looks like for the consumer. And throughout this talk, the consumer is going to be color-coded as green, plant or springbok, and the consumer is going to be blue. Okay? So this is what you get at the equilibrium for the traits. You get these relationships between fitness and the phenotype of that species. The consumer equilibrates at about a value of about 15.5 for the exact values I used in this simulation. And the resource equilibrates at a phenotype just above that. Note, one thing that often happens in these models is that one of the species may actually equilibrate at a fitness minimum. And that's because there's frequency-dependent selection dynamics that drive this. And so even though it's sitting at a fitness minimum, if the phenotype of the resource in this case would change slightly, it will be pushed by natural selection back to this fitness minimum. Now, these are the overall relationships in fitness. Here are the selection gradients on birth fitness component and death fitness component for the resource. Notice that at this equilibrium, selection wants to decrease the trait value to a value of 10, which is what maximizes its birth rate. But selection due to the predator or to the consumer consuming it wants to increase the phenotypic value because it wants to get away from the predator in phenotype space. And so this optimum is set because it's the balance of the selection gradients on these two fitness components. So on the overall fitness surface, it is the point where the fitness gradient on each individual fitness component sum to 0. Now, we often try to convince reviewers or editors, having been an editor and hear this argument all the time, that when I go out and measure fitness and I measure something, it's really a surrogate for overall fitness. And if you remember the reviews that Joel Kingsolver and various other people have been writing, disruptive and stabilizing selection is very rarely seen in measures of selection in natural populations. It's dominated by directional selection. I think it's because basically what we're doing is measuring selection on fitness components. And I think this is actually something we should embrace because it really gives us an insight about how you balance the conflicting demands that a species is involved in. It's not just one thing, it's multiple things. In this case, it's only one trait. The problem gets much more complex when we're talking about selection on multiple traits influencing multiple fitness components, but I think that's one of the directions we need to go in. And the consumer balances at the same point. You balance the selection gradients on the two components of fitness for the consumer. So what you see out of this is that the values of fitness that you would measure in the population is what defines the abundance equilibrium. That is when the actual birth rate minus the death rate is equal to 0. Selection, trait equilibria are defined by balancing the selection gradients on those trait values. And so the joint equilibrium is due to balancing both the abundance, fitness values, and the gradients operating on those fitness components. As I said, most in these models, species always settle out at stabilizing or disruptive selection on overall fitness, but they almost always settle out at directional selection on individual fitness components. Now, that was what happens at equilibrium in this situation. Remember I said, let's imagine that the resource starts at the trait value that maximizes its maximum birth rate. And it's at its abundance equilibrium, and the consumer is at very low population size initially. Right? So what I've shown you here, these two columns are exactly the same fitness surfaces for these two species. Here I'm going to show you population size and trait value, but this is from the start. So the first thing you should notice is these are very different than what I showed you before, than what it looks like at equilibrium. The predator or the consumer is present in this system, but there is no selection whatsoever on the death rate of the resource. Now let's see if these overall fitness surfaces look like what they're going to look like at the equilibrium. So this is the dynamics of natural selection in this very simple system. So if you look at this, the resource doesn't evolve initially at all. It doesn't start evolving, so let me go back here a little bit. It doesn't start evolving until the abundance and the trait value of the consumer increase towards it. And if you notice, we've gone from in the fitness surface for the resource for its death rate, here, look at this panel. as the consumer increases, now we get a change in the fitness topography for that fitness component. Right? Now this consumer is imparting intense selection on it, and then they take off. And notice the evolution of the fitness surfaces until they reach the equilibrium. It's that kind of dynamics I think we need to pay attention to. And I'll show you what this happens in a minute. So to build a little intuition here, I want to show you something that happens very rarely. So Yoshida et al. Showed that coevolution of a consumer and a resource, in this case rotifers feeding on algae, can impart unique population dynamics in a system. It's also true that you can impart unique trait cycling dynamics in these systems. So here is the same relationship between a single consumer and a resource that have bidirectional dependent traits defining their interaction between one another, but in a different area of parameter space that's going to cause cycling of the trait values in both species. So let me start this for you and watch what happens. The resource is undergoing peak shifts. There's nothing that Sewell Wright said that's involved in this peak shift. The peak shift is driven by the change in the topography of the fitness surface. And the change in topography is caused by the change in the selection gradients operating on these underlying fitness components in here. So let's go back and look for a second here. Right? So here we're at a point where the trait value of the consumer is at its maximum. Of the resource is at its maximum, and the consumer is evolving towards the resource. Right? So watch what happens right here. So as it turns and the consumer continues to move towards the resource starts evolving towards the consumer. Remember, the consumer is eating the resource. Why would natural selection cause a prey item to become more susceptible to the predator in the system? What drives that is, at this point, the resource is so far from its optimum for birth rate that the selection gradient from the predator is actually less than the selection gradient operating on the birth rate. And so overall selection is actually pushing the resource towards the predator. And when it gets to the point where it exactly matches in trait value, there is no selection on death rate due to the consumer. But that is the point where the resource has maximum death rate from the predator. But once we pass that point, right, this consumer goes past, and now at this point over here, now selection is pushing in both directions on both fitness components. And so the resource zooms away, then the consumer comes back to it. And if you notice, what the resource is doing is moving back and forth on this fitness surface of birth rate. So it's going from low birth rate on one side to low birth rate on the other side. Now, I think the important point here is selection can actually drive fitness peak shifts. You don't need anything that Sewell Wright was talking about. That still may happen, but this is a much easier way to get a peak shift. The consumer basically is now just tracking a moving fitness optimum. Right? So the resource is experiencing two fitness peaks that are changing in relative height. The consumer is just chasing one fitness peak going back and forth. Now, we can also think about this as in the case of unidirectional dependent traits defining the interaction between these two species. And the trait cycling dynamics that you get out of this is very different. So here's the dynamics you get from this. So you can watch the mean trait values changing here. Look at what the resource is doing on its birth fitness component relative to the death rate. So it zooms out, then it zooms back. It's still undergoing a peak shift, but what it is doing in this case is moving from areas where it has a high birth rate and a low death rate in one part of the cycle to the other end of the cycle. It goes to a low birth rate and a high death rate. So in this case, trait dynamics, in this case, are causing the resource to undergo a fitness trade-off within the species. So it's going back and forth, trading off birth rate against death rate. The consumer's still chasing. If you have independent traits where really the fitness of an individual species can be determined solely by its own trait value, the dynamics that you get out of this trait cycling is much blander. And in fact, it's usually only one species where the trait cycling happens. And in this case, it's mainly driven by population dynamics and not changes in fitness overall. So the shape of the fitness surface is defined by the demographic weights of various fitness components in this. Now, what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is what are the trait values and the population abundances that come out the other end. So all of the dynamics we talked about for the last few slides are happening, but I'm just going to show you the end point, okay? So first of all, let's think about what happens if we look at two species that would be in different environments where the maximum birth rate of the resource is different. So you can imagine this environment is a nutrient poor environment, and this environment is nutrient rich for the resource, right? And the only thing that's changing is the height of this fitness component curve, right? The same fitness value is favored in both of these environments, and it's just that the resource has a higher birth rate, maximum birth rate in this environment as opposed to that one. So that's what we're looking at. Where would these systems end up if we were putting them in different environments? What you see is that if you have the maximum birth rate of the resource is too low, there are not enough resources to actually support a population of the consumer. So below a particular point, the resource evolves exactly to the trait value that maximizes its birth rate because there are no consumers around. Once the resource species is at high enough abundance to support consumers, now we get selection. If we increase the productivity of the environment in this case, is what you could think about this axis being. Increase the productivity, you increase the abundance of both species, but for the resource, the important thing is you're increasing the abundance of the predator. That causes the consumer or the resource to actually evolve farther away from its optimal birth value. So just depending on the productivity of the environment, you get quantitatively different outcomes to evolution. It's not just the presence or absence of species. It is the abundances of the species. And just to see this, here are those fitness relationships you get if you have a maximum birth rate for that curve of 3 at the optimal phenotype. Notice there's almost no selection on the death fitness component. But if we crank that up to 9, you get really strong selection gradient operating on death for the resource. Now let's think about this for the consumer. For the consumer, we're going to do the same thing for the minimum value at its optimal phenotype for its death rate. Okay, so now again, this graph is basically showing you different environments. So you could think about this as there are other species we're not modeling in the system, increase the death rate of the consumer, or the diseases are present, or it's a harsher environment for the consumer as we move along this gradient. But if the minimum consumer death rate is too high, it cannot maintain a population, and so the resource equilibrates at its birth optimum. But as we decrease the consumer death rate, the consumer's abundance increases, and that causes the resource's trait to evolve farther from its own optimum. The consumer can chase this species farther out away from its own or its own optimal phenotype for its death rate, which I've shown here, because it has a lower maximum death rate. Now, this also applies for the attack coefficient between the two species. So for those of you who don't think about predator-prey models all the time, the attack coefficient is basically the rate at which the consumer eats the resource. So if you have a higher attack coefficient, the consumer can eat the resources at a faster rate. So here what we're doing is just saying we're looking at different environments where this maximum is different. The shape overall stays the same. As we, at a low enough value, again, you can't support a consumer population. You should be able to predict now what the resource is going to do. And as we increase the attack coefficient, now the consumer can move away. The resource will evolve away from the consumer because now we've made the interaction between the two species more strong, right? But the changes in the underlying relationship in these fitness components are exactly the same, right? You get the same change by changing parameters and changing the factors that influence the abundance of the species. You can also change the selection intensity on species. So for example, if we look at the attack coefficient, right, we can say when these species are actually matched to one another, which gives you the maximum attack coefficient, how fast does the attack coefficient change as you move away from that point? So in this case, and I've modeled this basically as a Gaussian function, right? So smaller numbers mean more intense selection gradients, right? In this case, the attack coefficient falls off very quickly away from this optimum. Here at a value of 15, it falls away at a very slow rate. So if we look at what happens here, so now you've got to remember that moving this way on this axis is increasing the underlying selection intensity on the interaction between these two species. That changes what natural selection favors at an equilibrium. We haven't changed anything about which traits values are favored. Here we're just monkeying around with selection gradients. You get comparable results if you do things about looking at the birth rate of the resource or the death rate of the consumer. Just changing this what I call the underlying intensity of selection gradients on these species, on these various fitness components. So the trait value that's favored by natural selection in each of these species depends critically on the traits of those species, but it also depends critically on the abundances of those species. It also depends on the demographic weights of various fitness components. What is the potential maximum that you can get out of them? But also on the selection intensities that operate on those individual components. So I think we really need to start thinking in a much more holistic ecological and evolutionary context and mechanistic interactions about how traits influence species interactions to really understand the dynamics of natural selection. So I'm a community ecologist, so I really am doing this to try to understand what community structure comes out the other end. So I want to talk very, very briefly about, just to give you a little glimmer of what happens when we now allow multiple species in the system and ask, can they diversify from one another? Right, so in this initial, what I want to talk about is a very simple community where we have one consumer here and two resource species. So now the consumer has two things to feed on. And I'm going to consider a very simple system here to just talk to you about the dynamics of this system. Initially, let's say that the two resources are coexisting with only one consumer, but the underlying and that bidirectional dependent traits define the attack coefficients between each resource and the consumer, and that the two resources have identical parameters for everything we've talked about. So they're the same maximum birth rate, they have the same relationships between birth rate and abundance, everything's the same about these two. And we're going to start the system with both resources having nearly identical phenotypes to one another. And we're just going to allow this system to then come to its ecological and evolutionary equilibrium. Now, I like predation, so this is why I work on apparent competition. I could show you results for resource competition of two consumers feeding on one resource, and everything is exactly the same. Everything is exactly analogous. So here are the fitness relationships for these two consumers, dark green and light green. Again, for the resources, the consumer again is in blue. Overall fitness in this row, birth fitness for each species in this row, death fitness in this row, and again, the dynamics of population size through time and mean trait in the population through time. Remember, the resources start at a higher value than the consumer. They're at higher abundance, what's going to happen. So what's right here? These species, the two resources, differentiate from one another in this situation of population dynamics. Why do they differentiate from one another? The light green species underwent a peak shift. It underwent a peak shift for exactly the same kind of dynamics that I showed you when we were talking about the trait cycling. So if we go back to the point here, right? So now at this point, the light green species is the species closer to the consumer in trait value. Look at what happens to its death component and its birth component as we move it forward. Selection overall is pushing this species back toward its birth optimum because the selection gradient on its birth fitness component is stronger than the selection gradient on its death fitness component. And so this resource species evolves towards the predator. Again, an evolutionary, very stupid thing to do, except that's the dynamics of natural selection that are driving it. Right? And again, at this point right here, where the phenotypes of this species, this resource, and this consumer exactly match, there is no selection from the predator on this, or there's no selection from the consumer on this resource. Everything is because of selection on its birth fitness component. But as soon as this species crosses the trait value, now both fitness selection gradients are pushing it to lower trait values. And so now it takes off, but what the consumer does is then tries to equilibrate between the two because these are defined by these bidirectional traits. Right? That species undergoes a peak shift. This species almost undergoes a peak shift until the consumer starts chasing the other one, and now it can evolve the other way and go, oh, I'm safe over here, so we'll straddle it. What happens if you've got two identical species at each of these two trophic levels? I'm not going to talk about the dynamics because the dynamics are exactly the same as what I just showed you. In this case, I'm going to again talk to you about the endpoint. So here are gradients, so you can think about this as different environments for, again, productivity, which influences the maximum birth rate of the resource. Again, a gradient of the minimum death rate of the consumer, and the maximum attack coefficient that we talked about. But now it's between two pairs of initially identical species, and the underlying parameters for both of the species at each trophic level remain identical throughout this. The only thing that's changing is abundance and trait value. Right? Let's think about what's happening here. So the green, dark green and light green are again the mean values of the traits of these two resource species when the system comes to equilibrium. And the two blue lines are when the two are the mean trait values for the two consumers when the system comes to equilibrium for a given parameter. At really low maximum birth rate, neither of the species at either trophic level differentiate from one another. If we make the environment just a little more productive, the resources differentiate from one another, but the consumers don't. Basically because in this case what happens is the resources aren't abundant enough to actually foster differences in selection on the consumers. But if we make the environment productive enough, both of these species differentiate from one another. The same thing happens as we decrease the minimum death rate of the consumer. If the death rate of the consumer is too high, its abundance is too low, and nobody differentiates at either trophic level. Move to a different environment where it's lower, the resources differentiate, but the consumers do not. But make the death rate of the consumers low, the minimum death rate of the consumers low enough in a different environment, and they both differentiate. It works exactly backwards for attack rate because that's the parameter that defines the interaction between these two species. So if you make the parameter that makes the interaction between these two species stronger, that's when consumers and resources differentiate from one another. So if you think about these fitness components, right, here what we're talking about, these are two fitness components that only influence one of the species. So if we make those very difficult for the two species, they do not differentiate. But interaction, the parameters that influence the interaction between the species, if we make those important, that's what fosters differentiation of these species. All we're changing here is really the environment that we find these species in. And we get fundamentally different answers to will they differentiate or not, right? If we're in a low productivity environment, we would expect no differentiation. If we're in a productive environment, we would expect differentiation of these species. We can get exactly the same outcomes when we look at this underlying intrinsic selection gradient on each of these fitness components. Right? So if we increase the strength of the selection gradients on these fitness components that only influence one of the species, making those selection gradients stronger inhibits differentiation. But if we actually increase the selection gradients on the fitness component that defines the interaction between the two species, we foster differentiation. So it really depends on the relative strengths of the values of fitness and the relative selection gradients operating on different fitness components to define whether species will differentiate from one another or not. So whether these species in a community context are going to differentiate from one another depends on all of this underlying relationships between fitness. And the primary prerequisite is that selection gradients generated by species interactions must be stronger than the gradients on other fitness components that only influence that species in and of itself. Now, I said I was a community ecologist at heart, and the reason I'm really doing this is to try to understand what sort of community structure emerges out of this. And I'm showing you here results for a very simple system of only 2 consumers and 2 resources. But you get exactly the same relationships if you look at, if we were to add 5 species at each trophic level and add a trophic level to it. You get exactly the same results out of this. If the interaction between these species is defined by a unidirectional dependent trait, you get this structure for the community. So the magnitude of these arrows define the interaction strength between these 2 species. So for those of you who know your community ecology, species 2 has a bigger effect on resource 1 than consumer 2 has on resource 2. That's what I mean by having a thicker arrow here than here. But if you look at this, both consumers have the same rank interaction strength with all of the resources in the system. So both species are better at eating resource 1 than they are at eating resource 2. And this is a fundamental result that comes out of these models, is that if you have unidirectional dependent traits and actually unidirectional independent traits defining the interaction between the 2 species, you end up with community structures where each of the consumers in the system have exactly the same hierarchy of the prey they feed on. So if you think about it, right? Cheetah, slower predator. If running speed is what gets you away from predators, if you're the fastest predator, you can eat everybody. If you're the fastest prey, you can get away from every predator in the system. Right? So every species ends up, all the interactions end up with the same rank relationship between them. In contrast, if we have bidirectional dependent traits, that's when you can get differentiation of consumers onto different resources. So in this case, consumer 2 imposes a much greater death rate on consumer 1 or on resource 1 than it does on 2, but consumer 2 imposes much greater death rate on resource 2 than on resource 1. So in this case, they've differentiated from one another. And if you look at real communities, this makes fundamental predictions. So here's a relationship between plant and a community of plants and seed dispersers that Jordi Bascomp and a number of his collaborators have put together for a number of different systems. And what you see is, in this community, you see hierarchical relationships. So this plant species interacts with every seed disperser, whereas this plant species only interacts with a couple of seed dispersers. And you see the same relationship for both the consumer and the resources in this system. Everybody has the same rank interaction strength with species at other trophic levels. That, to me, suggests a hypothesis that that interaction is driven by a unidirectional trait defining the interaction. But if we think about the systems that community ecologists love to talk about, where species are differentiating from one another, a lot of these, like lizards living in trees, or sticklebacks differentiating onto different resources, or Darwin's finches feeding on seeds, they differentiate from one another, and each consumer is best capable of feeding on a particular resource. If we think about these three systems, all of these are defined by bidirectional dependent traits. So what I want to leave you with is we really need to start thinking about this in the context of both population dynamics and natural selection at the same time. So we take these fundamental models that we use to describe fitness, and we think of it either in a populations dynamics context, so we call things DRRDT, or we think about it in a natural selection context, and we look at individual average fitness mapped against trait values. Wherein, as a matter of fact, what we're doing is actually looking at one fitness surface. So this is a fitness surface for one resource species that has one trait and one abundance. But we can think about this scaling up to multiple species in a community, where this overall fitness surface for a particular species has axes that define a particular value based on the traits of not only it, but all the other species in the system, but also the abundance of itself and the abundance of all the other species in the system. Right? So, but here what we're just looking at a very simplest, because we can only think in 3 dimensions. If we're talking about population dynamics, we are actually just taking a slice through this fitness surface parallel to the abundance axis and defining at a particular mean trait value. And then we talk about that as population dynamics and how our populations regulated. When we're talking about natural selection, we slice this fitness surface orthogonal to that, along trait axes. And we say for a given, we're basically making the implicit assumption for a particular abundance of all the species in the system, what is the relationship between fitness and the trait value we're looking at? Whereas, in matter of fact, what we're doing is actually just taking 2 different perspectives on the same structure. And I think that we really need to start thinking about the dynamics of abundance and the dynamics of traits as being the same process and feeding back on one another. Right? Many of you should be able to figure out where the equilibrium is going to be on this fitness surface. It's going to be at a point, in this case, on a line that runs around this surface at a fitness value, or log fitness value of 0, but where the selection gradient on the overall fitness surface also is 0 to define the joint equilibrium value. And I think that's really important, because I don't think we can understand natural selection without understanding it this way. We've got to stop going, I'm an evolutionary biologist or I'm an ecologist, and we've really got to talk about, I'm a naturalist. I want to end by thanking Russ Landy and Peter Abrams, who are the 2 fellows that did the most to create the machinery that I used to play around with this. And I want to take questions, and I want to thank you for listening. So there haven't been too many questions today, but if anybody has questions, there are microphones here if you want to talk about it. Oh, I should point out, immediately following this, there is a business meeting of the American Society of Naturalists, and we have 2 very important topics to talk about, and it's in room 3, which is that way. Any questions? If you don't have a question, we got to go to the business meeting. Yes, sir.
So it seems that.
Can you go to a microphone? They're recording.
So it seems that generation time could be a huge thing that might affect these dynamics. What do your models predict with like different generation times between host and And
So I haven't. I've just been playing with this, and so I haven't moved into that. But Mike Barfield and Richard Gomulkiewicz and Bob Holt extended Landy's framework into a full life history model to show what you could do with that. So if there are any people looking for PhD projects out there, Richard, I know Richard's here. I don't know if Mike and Bob are here, but go talk to Richard about extending it into that fitness component. Yes, David.
So pretty much everybody's presidential address is, let's make this a little more complicated. So everybody should start to do things even more complicated. And that's hard.
Yes, it is hard.
So
do you want? Do you have anything else, Dave?
is there any hope?
I think, well, so what got me thinking about this when I was in graduate school was I would go, so, you know, I took my evolution classes, I took population genetics, I took quantitative genetics, and in those classes, I was told to assume that the fitness values associated with traits or associated with alleles don't change because it's so complicated. We look at the evolution of quantitative traits in real populations, and we say, well, okay, so we know the populations going to go someplace, but if you think about what's happening, what I'm saying is the fitness surface changes fundamentally as these species evolve in response to one another. What I'm trying to do here is to say, I effectively said, let's make the genetics simple and not really worry about the complications created by genetics, but remember that there's also ecological dynamics in this, right? If you're talking about peak shifts, right? I have read dozens of papers about how peak shifts can be accomplished. Not one of them talks about just the fitness surface changes just because of the traits of the species in the system change, right? Right shifting balance assumes a constant fitness relationship between alleles, or if you put it in a Simpsonian framework, between fitness and phenotypes. And we say, how can you get this species from this fitness peak to that one, because it has to go downhill selection. Something has to operate to push it downhill on the fitness surface. Right? I think a fundamental thing of this is just to say, no, fundamentally, that doesn't need to happen. Actually, the dynamics of selection can drive that. And I agree with you completely that, right, I'm ignoring all the genetic complexities in this. But I'm not a geneticist, so I can do that, at least for a while. And my fervent hope is it becomes less complicated to put the complex dynamics of genetics and the complex dynamics of ecology together to understand how these species work. I think there's also just some fundamental things about how we go out and look at selection and measure natural selection in real populations that comes out of this too. Right? It depends on what kind of trait you're looking at. All traits are not created equal. When you measure the selection this generation, if all that changes is the abundances of the species from this generation to the next generation, the fitness surface is going to change. That seems like important information we need to pay attention to, because we always talk about, well, this year it was disrupted and this year it was stabilizing. Well, that may not be because the environment changed at all, except just like there's more of the resources and there's fewer of the consumer this year. I know that's not a satisfying answer. I have no satisfying answer for it getting more complex, but, you know, it gets more complex. I'm sorry. Lynn?
So to follow up from David.
Oh, God. Okay.
Okay. What's an evolutionary ecologist interested in understanding selection, how it works on the multitude of traits that affect fitness? I mean, what are we to do? I've done selection studies in the field. I've tried to do it over multiple years and multiple sites. What am I doing wrong?
I don't think you're doing anything wrong. So I've dealt with these models, putting multiple species into the Landy-esque framework here, and just looking at those systems. I think there's sort of a heuristic that comes out of this exercise for me, and it really is, we shouldn't be afraid to say we're not working on overall selection, because the action is actually how do you balance the contributions of different fitness components and selection on those different fitness components. And that's true whether it's one trait influencing multiple components, or it's multiple, two traits that each influence separately two different fitness components, or scale up to multiple traits on multiple components. So I think part of what, for me, comes out of this is really just a shift in how we think about studying selection in nature and what we do with the data we do collect, and not try to shove it into a framework where I'm looking at overall fitness, and it just so happens I only look at survival selection, but survival selection is actually correlated with overall fitness. I mean, I read that for 4 years as an editor of AMNAT. It's like, no, you measured selection on survival. That's important in and of itself. But once you understand that, then look at selection on fecundity in and of itself. And how do those two things go together then? And then I will let all you geneticists then worry about the genetic relationships between those traits and how that's going to also skew where the system's going to go. But, that's not my problem. My problem is this, in trying to convince you that you really should pay attention to the dynamics of fitness surfaces, because we know they change. And we know exactly why they change. So that's not a good answer either, but anybody else want to? No questions? Well, thank you. Let's go have a drink.